I live alone, and thieves have been raiding my ranch every night. That's what a desperate widow admitted to a stranger who'd only stopped to ask for water, begging him for protection. And fate, friends, has the strangest ways of showing up right when you need it. The sun was already sinking behind the ridge when Jane Whitmore heard hoofbeats coming up the dirt road. For one moment, brief as a heartbeat, she feared they'd finally come for her. She was standing by the fence line of her ranch, that crooked row of posts she'd straightened herself, with her own 2 hands, holding a tin water pail fresh from the well, while the sky burned orange above her. A blaze of copper light spilled over the pastures over the old windmill turning slow, and over the handful of cattle still grazing in the long shadows of evening. At Sparrow Creek, that hour was always the most beautiful, and the one that frightened her most. Because behind that golden light, darkness always waited. And with the darkness, they came. Jane was 41 years old. She'd spent 3 years living alone on the ranch that once belonged to her late husband, land that had been her grandfather's before that. 3 generations of men who'd worked themselves into the ground so that in the end, only she was left holding the fort. A woman with sun-worn hands, dark hair streaked with gray, and the weariness so deep in her bones that not even sleep could touch it. The hoofbeats grew closer against the packed earth. Jane pressed the pail to her chest and squinted against the blinding light. At the end of the road, cut black against that fire-colored sky, a rider appeared. A lone man, hat pulled low, shoulders slumped with exhaustion, sitting a horse caked in trail dust. It looked like the 2 of them had ridden clear from the edge of the world, dragging miles of tiredness behind them. Jane's heart slammed in her chest. Every instinct life had beaten into her screamed to get inside and throw the bolt. A stranger on horseback at this hour, when the world had no more witnesses? That never brought anything good. Any other day she'd have bolted for the house. But some strange pull kept her rooted to the spot. Maybe it was the way the man approached, slow, with no malice in him, head down, and his whole body given over to exhaustion, like someone who no longer had the strength left to hurt anybody. Or maybe it was her own tiredness, the kind that sometimes weighs heavier than fear itself. Who's to say it wasn't just fate putting the right person in your path at exactly the right moment? Seeing her by the fence, the rider eased back on the reins. The sorrel horse stopped a few paces off, blowing hard. The man touched 2 fingers to the brim of his hat, an old gesture of respect almost nobody remembered anymore. "Evening, ma'am," the stranger said, his voice rough and worn, like a man who hadn't spoken in days. "Don't mean to trouble you, but I've come a long way and my horse is about done in. Would you be kind enough to let me draw some water from your well, for the both of us?" Jane studied him carefully with the sharp eye of someone whose life depended on reading a man's intentions right the first time. His face was sun-cracked, several days of beard on his jaw, and his eyes sat deep with exhaustion. She saw no cruelty in them. She knew the look of a mean man well enough. She'd had plenty of them get too close. This stranger's eyes belonged to someone who'd lost everything. So, without a word, she stepped forward and handed him the pail. "It's fresh from the well. Drink first, then we'll see to your horse," Jane offered steady. The man looked thrown off balance for a moment. He hesitated like he wasn't used to anyone offering a hand without expecting something back. Then he swung down off the horse, stiff and slow, the fatigue showing in every movement. When he took the pail, his fingers brushed hers. Jane noted at once. Rough, big hands. Hands made for hard work, for the shovel, the rope, and the reins of a life that doesn't go easy on you. He drank slow at first, savoring it, then greedily, eyes shut. When he finished, he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and passed the pail back to her, grateful. "God bless you for this, ma'am," he murmured, relieved after a whole day under a punishing sun. And right then, Jane did something unthinkable. She wasn't a woman who acted without thinking. For 3 long years she'd weighed every word and every gesture like her life depended on it, because a widow alone on the frontier can't afford mistakes. But with the sun set at her back and this stranger in front of her, something inside her cracked open. An anguish she'd been holding down for weeks came pouring out of her chest. Before a lifetime of caution could stop her, the words tumbled out.
"I live alone,"
she blurted, looking him straight in the eye.
"I'm completely alone,"
she repeated, feeling her voice shake. It made her angry, that tremble in her voice, but there was no taking it back now.
"There's nobody else on this ranch. My husband died 3 years ago, and since then I've been pulling this wagon by myself. But lately," she swallowed hard, "I've been dealing with cattle thieves.
Every night they come in the dark and steal my stock. They've already taken 9 head. 9! I go out with my shotgun, fire into the air, holler myself hoarse, but I'm one woman against however many of them there are. One of these nights they're going to figure out nobody's really protecting this place." Her voice broke. "And then, I don't know what'll become of me." The silence that fell over the yard was overwhelming, the windmill creaking, the sky going dim. Sarah Jane wiped her tears fast with her sleeve, ashamed of unraveling in front of a total stranger. But it was said now. Gathering what little dignity she had left, she steadied her voice to admit what really weighed on her. "I need a man to protect me, even if it's just for a few days. I'm not rich, but I can offer a room to sleep in, a hot meal, and I'll pay you whatever I'm able. You look like a man of your word, and I just can't do this alone anymore." The stranger fell into a heavy silence. He looked past her at the ranch, the modest house with its rough porch, the windmill, the pastures, the thin scattering of cattle fading into the dusk. When his eyes finally settled back on her, Sarah Jane thought she caught a shadow of old pain there, like the word protection had reopened some old wound. "Name's Nathaniel, ma'am," he said at last, quiet. "Nate Coulter. And it's been a long time since I had anybody to protect." He didn't give her a clear yes, but he didn't climb back on his horse and ride off into the night either. And Sarah Jane, who'd walled herself off from the world for 3 years, knew right then that this tired man, who'd only wanted to quench his thirst, was going to stay. For good. Nothing at Sparrow Creek would ever be the same again. To understand why Sarah Jane Whitmore, after 3 years of total isolation, decided to trust a stranger so suddenly, we have to look back. We need to understand the wounds life had already carved into her, and above all, the crushing weight of her loneliness. Because things hadn't always been this way. There was a time, one that now felt like another life entirely, when Sparrow Creek overflowed with happiness. She used to wake before dawn to the smell of coffee that Thomas made, singing off-key while pulling on his boots at the edge of the bed. Thomas, her husband, the man she'd married at 20 and shared almost 19 years of happiness with. No absences except for herding season. No fights, except the kind that people who truly love each other forgive easy. That man had been a gentle giant with an easy laugh and hands like dinner plates. Folks around the county said there wasn't anybody in 3 counties who understood animals better. Thomas could gentle a wild colt just by talking to it, and he'd know a cow was sick 3 days before she showed a single symptom. The cattle and the land held a kind of sacred respect for him, and Sarah Jane adored him with that quiet, deep love that shows itself in small, daily things. A hot plate of food, a mended shirt, the brush of hands searching for each other in the dark of the bed. The only thing that ever dimmed their happiness was never having children. They'd tried with everything they had. They prayed, they waited, but the miracle never came. Everything changed sharp and sudden on a morning 3 years back that Sarah Jane still remembered with painful clarity. Thomas had bought a magnificent but wild young bull to improve the herd, and he'd been out in the corral trying to break him. She, meanwhile, was in the kitchen, kneading bread. The shouting from the hired men reached her before she could even grasp the size of the tragedy. By the time she ran out, hands still white with flour, it was already too late. One blink. That's all the time it takes a half-ton animal to charge. That's all it took to erase 19 years of shared life. The bull turned on him, and Thomas slipped in the mud. Afterward, to comfort her, people told her he hadn't suffered, that it was fast like that was supposed to help, like the speed of the tragedy somehow lightened the weight of it. She buried him on the hill next to his parents, under a big old cottonwood tree that looked down over the whole ranch. From that terrible day on, Sarah Jane was completely alone. At first, the hired hands tried to stick around, but everybody knows a ranch without an owner at the reins goes under fast, and a widow with empty pockets can't make payroll. One by one, they drifted off to find work on other spreads. Sarah Jane didn't hold it against them. A man's gotta eat, after all. But every hand who crossed that property line took a piece of her memories of Thomas with him. Soon she found herself alone against the sheer size of it all. 60 head of cattle, a broken windmill, a well that needed tending, and only her own 2 hands to make it work. And by God, she did it. Against every prediction. She learned to herd cattle on horseback, to doctor a wound on a cow's flank, to sleep with a shotgun by her side. She worked herself to the bone, up before dawn, in bed well past dark. When exhaustion got the better of her, she'd look up toward the hill where Thomas rested and whisper a few words. "Today was a hard one, old man," she'd say with the last of her voice, "but I made it through another day." It didn't take long for the men of the county to start circling the ranch, some with good intentions, most with something far darker in mind. Seeing a widow alone with land and cattle, they figured she was easy pickings. 6 months after she buried her husband, a suitor asked for her hand, though he spent more time talking about the acreage at Sparrow Creek than about her. Another man, bolder still, offered her protection in exchange for favors that made her want to spit in his face. She ran every last one of them off her land. A widow's heart is a strong box with too many locks on it. That's how she toughened up. Blow by blow, Sarah Jane raised her walls and learned the art of not trusting a soul. But a few weeks back, danger had come knocking anyway. The thefts started. At first, she figured she'd miscounted, but the next day, 2 more cows were missing. She found wagon wheel ruts and a fence line cut clean through. This wasn't lost stock. These were thieves, working the shadows, coming to take what little she had left. So she started standing guard, sitting on the porch with the shotgun across her lap. Sarah Jane would go tearing blind through the dark the second she heard something off in the pasture, shouting and firing warning shots into the air. Sometimes it worked. Other times she got there too late and only found gaps in the herd. They'd already taken 9 head off her. 9. Every stolen animal was a bite out of her livelihood, and without them, ruin would eventually force her to sell. Selling the land would mean betraying Thomas, his father, and his grandfather, all the men who'd worked themselves into the ground for it. But worse than any of that was the fear. When night fell, a cold terror ran through her at the thought of being alone, miles from the nearest town, with thieves stalking the dark. A woman with nobody to lean on? We all know how that story tends to go. The world's a magnet for men without a conscience, and she knew her luck was running out. So when an exhausted stranger stopped to ask for water, Sarah Jane saw something clean in his eyes. A gut feeling told her this was it. Her last shot at not being forgotten out here. And that's how she came to ask a total stranger to protect her. Sarah Jane had no idea yet that the man she'd just taken in was carrying a soul just as broken as her own. That first evening, as the sun sank behind the hills and Nate unsaddled his horse, neither one of them had the faintest idea what fate had planned for them. He pulled the saddle off the sorrel, slow, with the heaviness of a man who carries his grief in his bones. As he loosened the cinch and hung up the tack, she watched him from the porch. Something in the way he handled that animal told her everything about the man without a single word needed. No jerking, no rushing. He ran a hand aware the horse's sweaty neck, with a gentleness that isn't learned, only born into a person. He spoke to the horse so quiet that only a faint murmur reached her, almost like a prayer. Thomas had that same gift, and Sarah Jane felt her chest tighten. It had been 3 years since she'd seen a man handle an animal with that kind of tenderness. "Water trough's over yonder," she told him. "And there's fresh hay in the feed bin." "Thank you, man," he answered, absorbed in checking the sorrel's hooves one by one, looking for stones. "This poor fellow's got a rock wedged in his shoe," Nate said. "No wonder he's been favoring that leg." He pulled a folding knife from his pocket, worked it out carefully, and drew out a stone the size of a fingernail. The horse snorted in relief and set the hoof down easy. Nate patted its flank. "There you go, old-timer. That's better." Sarah Jane, unable to hold back her curiosity, asked, "Where do you hail from, Nate, if you don't mind me asking?" At that, the man straightened slowly and pulled off his hat. Underneath, dark hair graying at the temples tumbled loose. Without the brim shading his face, Sarah Jane could finally see his eyes. They were beautiful and sad, the kind that have cried themselves dry. "Nowhere in particular, ma'am, and everywhere," he admitted. "Been on the road about 4 years now, ranch to ranch wherever they need an extra hand. Job's done, I pack up and move on. Don't tie myself down any place." "And why is that?" The question slipped out before she meant to ask it, and she figured he'd just go quiet. But some nights the loneliness sits so heavy, the soul needs to let something out. "Because staying puts down roots, ma'am," he murmured. "You stay in a place, you get attached to the people, the land, the walls around you. And I don't want to get attached to anything anymore. Attachment's what tears you apart when you lose it. The road's easier because out on the trail there's nothing to lose on account of you never own anything to begin with." Sarah Jane studied him in silence. She understood that emptiness completely. She'd stayed, but she'd built the very same walls. 2 different ways of running from the same pain. "What did you lose, Nate?" she asked gently. The man sat down on the edge of the water trough, turning his hat over and over in his hands. Outside, the last light of day faded completely, and the stars began to prick through. The night filled with a cricket's song, while Nate, eyes fixed on the ground, confessed what he'd kept quiet for 4 years. "I had my own land once. Little spread nothing like this, but it was mine. Built it up with my father, and when he passed, I kept going, alone. Wasn't doing bad for myself. Built up a small herd, fixed the house up, and at 38 I got married." His voice cracked, and he cleared his throat to steady himself. "Her name was Rose. Met her at a dance in town. I swear to you, ma'am, she had the purest soul in this world, not a mean bone in her. The kind of person who smiles and just brightens your whole day. We got married. She came to live with me. And I'll tell you, those were the happiest years of my life. The only truly good ones. She'd sing all day long, even while cooking. I'd be out working the range, and I'd hear her voice carrying from a distance, and that alone gave me the strength to keep going. You know, I felt like everything finally made sense." Sarah Jane nodded quietly, understanding that feeling all too well. It had been the same for her with Thomas. "A year in, she got pregnant," Nate went on, his voice barely above a whisper. "You can't imagine the joy we felt. I built a cradle with my own 2 hands, spent whole nights sanding the wood smooth so it'd be just right for the baby. Rose sewed little clothes. We picked out names, argued about it, laughing. She wanted to name her after her own mother if it was a girl, and I wanted my name if it was a boy. We had everything, ma'am. Everything." It all fell apart at once. Sarah Jane stayed quiet, patient, knowing well that hush that comes right before tragedy, the silence before the unspeakable. "The day of the birth came, and things went wrong," Nate managed at last, stringing the words together like they cost him his life to say. "The midwife couldn't do a thing. I rode for the doctor in town, hard as that horse could run, but the distance was too far, and he got there too late. By the time he came through that door, there was nothing left to be done. I lost them both that night, Rose and the baby together. I went into the room and there they were, still. And I just stood frozen in the doorway, not knowing what to do. A man who could break wild colts and stare down an angry bull, and there I stood, unable to take one step toward the bed where my wife lay dead and my son never even drew breath. I just stood in that doorway, helpless as a lost child. Sarah Jane's eyes filled. She wiped the tears away quick with the back of her hand, but it was too late. He'd already noticed, and in that moment of silence, something passed between them, a mutual recognition. Two wounded souls marked by the same kind of tragedy. Two survivors of the same quiet war against a fate that sometimes shows no mercy to good people. "I'm so sorry, Nate," she whispered, meaning it fully. "It's all right now," he answered, though they both knew that kind of pain never truly leaves. I buried them together, in the same box. Didn't have it in me to separate them. And after that, nothing mattered anymore. The ranch fell apart the second I stopped caring about it. Then came a drought, the bad kind, no mercy in it, and near all my cattle died. And I just watched them go, didn't lift a finger. What for? What was the use of saving the cattle when there wasn't anything left worth saving? The bank came calling for the loans from the good years, and when I couldn't pay, they took the land. My father's land, where Rose was buried. Nate lifted his head and looked at Sarah Jane with hollow eyes. That's what eats at me the most. Weighs on my soul, you understand? It isn't losing the ranch that tears me up. Land belongs to God in the end. What guts me is that she's still there. Rose and the baby, buried on somebody else's land now, with strangers living in our house. I can't even bring her a flower. New owner would run me off with a shotgun if he caught me anywhere near there. That's why I never stop moving, so I don't have to think on it. Because the day I stop, I remember. And when I remember, it's unbearable. The silence after that ran long, solemn. The stars had covered the whole sky by then, and the windmill creaked in the night breeze. And Sarah Jane, a woman with armor thick enough to keep anyone out, felt something soften inside her, scaring her and comforting her both at once. "I lost my husband 3 years ago," she confessed, not fully sure why, feeling like after seeing his wound, she couldn't keep hiding her own. "A bull killed him. One careless second in the corral, one bad step, and 19 years together vanished in a blink. I couldn't have children either, so I ended up alone. I know what it feels like, Nate. I know what it's like to lie down every night in an empty bed and talk to nobody. I know how hard it is to wake up every morning and live it all over again, like it's the first time." Nate watched her, and for the first time something shifted across his face. It wasn't a smile, not even close, but it was like a muscle held tense for 4 years finally eased just a fraction, making him feel a little less alone. "Seems like the Lord goes around collecting the broken ones, ma'am," he said. "Sarah Jane. My name's Sarah Jane," she corrected him, her voice soft but firm. "Sarah Jane," he repeated, tasting the name. "That's a fine name. Sounds almost like an angel's." She dropped her gaze, blushing in a way she hadn't in years, feeling embarrassed like a young girl. She stood up quick from the porch. "You must be hungry," she said to cover the blush. "I'll go warm something up. You can sleep in the old bunkhouse behind the corral. It's plain, but it's clean. We'll talk about the rest come morning." "Sarah Jane," he stopped her as she headed toward the house. She turned. "I haven't agreed to protect you yet." Her heart dropped. He was right. Between one thing and another, poor Sarah Jane had plain forgotten this man hadn't promised her anything at all. At any moment he could pack his gear and ride on her ranch, just one more stop on an endless road. "I know," she answered, trying not to let her voice shake. "I'm not asking you for anything. If you decide to leave tomorrow, go right ahead. You've already done plenty just by listening." Nate turned his hat over in his hands. He looked out at the dark fields where the thieves lurked every night. Then he looked back at Sarah Jane standing in the doorway, holding up an oil lamp that barely lit her face. A woman alone, tired and brave, who'd opened her door to a stranger out of pure desperation. "I've spent 4 years running from anything that means taking care of something or someone," he confessed slowly. "And for 4 years I've been dying inside from having nothing left to hold on to. Maybe the Lord brought me down this road for a reason. I'll stay, Sarah Jane. I'll stay and protect you. Can't promise you forever. I don't make those kinds of promises anymore. But as long as those men are circling your cattle, I'll be right here. You have my word." And Sarah Jane, standing in the doorway with the lamp trembling in her hand, felt for the first time in 3 years the knot in her chest come loose. That night, she wouldn't be alone. "Thank you," was all she could manage. "Thank you, Nate." And she went inside to warm the supper. Silent tears slid down her cheeks as she stirred the pot. But this time, they weren't tears of grief. They were relief. That fragile, dangerous thing called hope, the one she thought she'd buried with Thomas on that hill, was blooming again, without asking permission. On his first night at Sparrow Creek, Nate didn't sleep a wink. Sarah Jane had warmed up a beef and potato stew with hard bread for dipping, and he ate slow, with the restrained hunger of a proud man. Though she noticed he clearly hadn't had a hot meal in some time. Supper passed in near total silence, the two of them sitting under the yellow glow of the kerosene lamp. You know, some silences save lives, and that was one of them. Sharing a warmth both of them had long since forgotten. Halfway through the meal, it struck Sarah Jane that this was the first time in 3 years she'd shared a table with anyone. A lump caught in her throat, and she had to drink some water to hide it. When they finished, Nate didn't head for the bunkhouse. He pulled an old but well-cared-for Winchester rifle from his saddlebag and sat down on the porch, staring out into the dark. "What are you doing?" she asked from the doorway. "You said they come at night," he answered without looking at her, checking the rifle by moonlight. "Well, tonight they'll find somebody waiting for them out here. Go on and get some rest, Sarah Jane. Sleep easy. I'll keep watch." She stood frozen, not sure how to respond. It had been weeks since she'd slept through a night, used to jolting awake at every sound and checking the window with the shotgun in hand. Lying down, knowing someone else was standing guard, felt like a luxury she couldn't quite believe in. "Would you like some company?" "I'm not tired," she said. "You've got shadows under your eyes deep enough to plow," Nate said, looking at her now with something almost tender in his expression. The lack of sleep on that poor woman was plain to see. "Look, if anything happens, I'll wake you, I promise. But I'd bet money they don't come tonight. Cowards like that can smell a wide-awake man from a mile off, and I've got good hearing and better aim." Sarah Jane hesitated a moment. Breaking with 3 years of absolute mistrust, she nodded slowly. "All right then," she said. "Shout if anything happens. I'm a light sleeper." "I know," he replied. "Folks who've been through something always sleep with one eye open." Sarah Jane went to her room, lay down fully dressed, just in case shotgun close by, and stared up at the ceiling, listening to the silence. In the dimness of her room she could hear the steady creak of the windmill, the singing of crickets, and an owl hooting somewhere off in the distance. Every so often the rock of Nate's rocking chair, or the scratch of a match as he lit a cigarette. Far from frightening her, it brought her a sense of peace. It meant someone was watching over her. And for the first time in weeks, Sarah Jane Whitmore fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. Outside, Nate kept watch sitting in the shadows with the rifle across his lap, the coal of his cigarette glowing on and off as he stared out over the land, thinking. He thought about Rose, same as every night. But this time the memory didn't cut with its usual bite. Maybe it was the clean country air, the hot meal in his belly, or knowing that on the other side of that wall a brave woman slept peaceful. Whatever it was, the ache of the memory felt gentler somehow. "Look where I ended up, Rose," he thought, gazing up at the stars. "Watching over the cattle of a widow who gave me water."
You always used to say I had a gift for protecting things. Maybe you were right. Around midnight, he heard them. It wasn't any one clear sound. Most anybody else would have missed it entirely. But Nate had grown up on the range, and his ear caught the strange in an instant. A rustle of grass, the tense huff of an unfamiliar horse, and the metallic snip of wire cutters. The sound was coming from the far fence line, right where the property met the scrub brush. Nate crushed his cigarette out against his boot heel, rose without a sound, and moved through the shadows, rifle in hand, bent low, quiet as an old cat that still remembers how to hunt. He didn't run, didn't shout. He knew raising a ruckus would only scare them off. For one night, and they'd be back the next, once they saw there was no real danger. And he didn't want to spook them. He wanted to see their faces, know exactly who he was up against. He reached the empty corral and crouched behind the feed trough. He saw them. 3 men, moving carefully in the darkness, cutting through the wire in dead silence. While one stood guard with a rifle, the other 2 eased a couple of cows toward the gap heads covered with a blanket to keep them from bawling, working with a practiced skill that gave away plenty of experience. Out in the brush, a wagon waited. They were planning to make off with the cattle that very night, same as they'd done with the other 9 head before. Nate had them dead to rights. From where he crouched, he could drop the one with the rifle before he even had a chance to react, then take the other 2 unarmed men easy after. It was the harsh law of the range with cattle thieves: one shot and move on, and nobody would ask a single question. Frontier justice was merciless, and night riders rarely lived to tell the tale. Nate already had his finger on the trigger, aimed square at the lookout's chest, when the wind carried him a scrap of talk. "Hurry it up," the man with the rifle whispered, edge of panic in his voice. "Gonna be light soon, and the kids didn't have a bite to eat yesterday. These 2 will carry us through the week. We can't keep coming back, it's too dangerous. One of these times the rancher catches us, and that's the end of it. Then we find honest work. I swear it, Ike, this is the last one. Wish to God there was honest work to be had." The man called Ike answered with a bitterness that ran chills down Nate's spine. That voice hit Nate somewhere deep. It wasn't that he knew this man in particular, it was the tone. It was the wail of somebody cornered by hunger. "Wish it too, brother, but there's nothing out there. And my kids are hungry. I'd rather go to hell as a thief than watch them starve to death." Nate lowered the rifle slowly, pulled his finger off the trigger, his heart hammering as something clicked into place that changed everything. These men weren't professional rustlers, weren't stealing out of meanness. They were desperate fathers, risking their lives and their souls in the dark to put food on the table because they had no other way out to save their children from ruin. For a man like Nate, who'd lost a child before it ever drew breath, that kind of pain was sacred. He simply couldn't pull the trigger. But he couldn't let them rob Sarah Jane blind either, because that cattle was another desperate person's livelihood too. Taking from the widow to feed Ike's children just traded one tragedy for another. There was no justice in that. Only misery passed hand to hand. Thinking fast, he made a decision that wasn't dictated by the head but by something deeper, that part of the soul that, in spite of everything life throws at it, refuses to turn to stone. Stepping out from behind the feed trough, Nate showed himself in the moonlight, rifle pointed at the ground, so they could see he wasn't looking for a fight. "Let the cattle go," he said, his voice steady but hard. The 3 men froze solid. The one with the gun, Ike, spun around instinctively, bringing his rifle up, and an unbearable tension filled the air. 2 armed men face to face in the dark. One wrong move and the night would end in tragedy. "Easy," Nate murmured, keeping the barrel down, showing he wasn't looking for trouble. "I'm not here to kill anybody. Could have dropped every one of you from that trough without you ever knowing what hit you, and I didn't. You know why I didn't shoot? Because I heard you talking about your kids." Ike didn't lower his weapon, but Nate didn't miss the way his hands were shaking. "Who are you?" he asked, voice cracking. "The widow lives alone.
There's no man out here. There is now, Nate replied. And that man's telling you to let those cows go and get on out of here and not come back, because next time I won't be in such a good mood. But before you go, listen close, Ike. Man to man, father to father. I lost a child too. One that never even got to be born. I know what's eating you up inside, so instead of killing you, I'm going to make you an offer. Confused, the three men looked at him through the darkness. Nate went on. Turn these cattle loose and ride out of here tonight with nothing to show for it. But tomorrow, first light, you come back alone, unarmed, and you talk to the woman who owns this ranch man to man, not as a thief. Might be there's honest work here for someone who knows cattle. Earning your bread in the daylight beats risking your neck stealing in the dark every time. Think it over. That's my offer. A heavy silence fell, broken only by the cattle's breathing and the wind. After staring at him in disbelief, Ike slowly lowered his rifle. "Why are you doing this for us?" he asked, distrust mixed with a flicker of hope. "We're thieves. We came here to steal. You ought to shoot us or hand us over to the law." Nate watched him in silence, and when he answered, his voice carried the weariness of 4 years on the road. "Because I was right where you're standing once," he confessed. "Lost and not knowing which way to turn. Nobody put out a hand for me. Nobody. And I spent 4 years rotting inside with rage and grief. I don't want your kids growing up with a father as bitter as I turned out. Let the cattle go and come back tomorrow to start fresh. That's all I'm asking." Ike stared at him a long moment. Without another word, he signaled to his men, and they let the cattle go, and the animals ambled back to the pasture, relieved. They gathered their gear in silence, and before disappearing into the brush, Ike stopped to look back at Nate over his shoulder. "I'll be back tomorrow. You have my word." And he vanished into the night. Nate stood alone, rifle in hand, letting it all sink in, heart still pounding. Had he done right? He didn't know. Maybe Ike had played him for a fool, or maybe Sarah Jane would run him off for not defending the ranch with lead the way anybody else in his position would have. But of one thing he was completely sure. For the first time in 4 long years, he'd made a decision that Rose would have been proud of. And that was enough to give him peace. That night he went back to the porch, settled in, with the rifle across his knees, lit another cigarette, and kept his watch under the slow wheel of the stars. On the other side of the wall, Sarah Jane slept deep unaware for the first time in a long while. She had no idea that the man who'd come asking for a drink of water had spared the lives of thieves that very night, and with that mercy, planted the seed of a whole new fate for everyone involved. And now, I ask you, what would you have done in Nate's place? Fired to protect what wasn't yours to give away? Or offered a hand seeing that the theft came from hungry children? Let me know what you think. Meanwhile, Sarah Jane woke with the sun on her face, feeling strange. She'd slept clean through, no jolting awake, no midnight patrols with the shotgun in hand. She lay still, disoriented, trying to remember the last time she'd woken up so rested, so clear-headed. She couldn't recall it. Months of pure anguish had passed. Who among us hasn't felt the weight of a promise made in the middle of the night? There it all was. The stranger, the water pail, the confession, and that man sitting in the hallway with the rifle across his lap telling her, "Sleep easy. I'll keep watch." Sarah Jane sat up fast, heart in her throat. Had he stayed the whole night? Or slipped off at dawn like the ones who promise and then out of sight, out of mind? And had the thieves come back? She smoothed her hair, splashed water on her face, and hurried to the hallway. And there, sure enough, was Nate, sitting in the same chair where she'd left him, worn out with sleep, hat tipped back, and the rifle resting between his knees. Foolish and noble, both staying up all night watching over a stranger, only to end up sleeping right there without ever touching a bed. Something in Sarah Jane's chest went soft looking at that scene, a big weathered man like that, asleep in a chair, still holding on to his rifle. It stirred up something almost motherly in her. She wanted to cover him with a blanket. She decided not to wake him. She slipped into the kitchen, stirred up the fire, and put the coffee on. While the water heated, worry pushed her out to check the pastures and count the cattle. She walked toward the far fence with her heart in her throat, dreading she'd find the wire cut and the herd thinned out again, same as so many other times. Thank goodness the cattle were all still there. She had to count twice before she could believe it. Under the morning sun, what was left of her herd grazed in complete calm, a relief that didn't last long. Reaching the edge of the property, Sarah Jane's brow furrowed. The fence was down. Somebody had cut the wire clean, leaving a big gap, and the mud showed human footprints and unfamiliar hoof marks. The thieves had come back, no doubt about it, but this time they'd left without touching a single animal. Why would they do something like that? No thief cuts a fence and rides off empty-handed. That's not how crime works. Something big had to have happened out there in the dark, something she still didn't know about. With a tangle of doubt and suspicion, Sarah Jane headed back to the house, turning the questions over in her mind. Nate was already up, stretching on the porch after washing his face at the corral trough. Seeing her come in from the field, his look told her he knew exactly what was on her mind. "They came last night," she said straight out, planting herself in front of him. "Cut the fence out back. There's tracks, but nothing's missing." "What happened, Nate?" The man studied her, weighing whether it was wise to lay out the whole truth. He rubbed his beard, sighed, and admitted, "Yes, 3 men came around midnight. They were cutting the wire to load 2 cows into a wagon they had hidden out in the brush." Sarah Jane's chest went tight. "And you shot them?" she asked, tense. "No," he answered, calm as anything. She just stared, not understanding at all. "What do you mean, no? Then why'd they leave empty-handed?" Nate looked her straight in the eye and with astonishing calm laid out exactly what had happened. He told her how he'd stalked them from behind the feed trough, rifle aimed dead at the leader, the shot already lined up. But right before he pulled the trigger, the wind carried him their voices. He told her what he'd heard those men say. Children crying for bread, terrible hunger, and the desperation of a father who'd rather be damned than watch his own kids starve. Turned out, Nate chose to lower the rifle step out into the moonlight and offer them a deal instead. He let them go empty-handed, but asked one of them, a man named Ike, to come back unarmed at first light to talk man to man, hinting there might be honest work waiting for him. Hearing that, Sarah Jane's face flushed not with embarrassment, but with an explosive mix of disbelief and a rage that finally boiled over. "What have you done?" she cried, voice breaking. "You let the very men who've stolen 9 heads of my cattle and kept me up nights scared out of my mind in my own home just walk away? And on top of it, you're inviting one of them onto my land for a job." Sarah Jane's fury hit its limit. Trembling head to toe, voice cracking with helplessness, she came at him hard. "Listen to me good. I asked you here to protect me from those low-down thieves, not to go making friends with them. You have any idea what every theft costs me? That's my food, my future. The difference between keeping or losing the land my late husband left me, and you who showed up yesterday and don't know the first thing about what I've suffered. You just let them walk off like it's nothing, and then invite one to breakfast." By the end of her outburst, the anger turned into tears she couldn't hold back. She was crying again in front of this stranger. She wiped her face hard, trying to pull back some composure and dignity. And here's where we see that Nate was cut from different cloth. He took the whole storm without a single word in his own defense. He didn't try to justify himself, didn't interrupt her. He simply let her pour out all the bitterness and terror she'd been carrying through weeks of sleepless nights. When she finally ran out of breath, he spoke to her with that calm, steady voice that could put out any fire. "You're right to be angry, Sarah Jane." She looked at him, thrown off. "You've got every right to be furious," he went on. "It's your cattle, and it's your life. I made a call last night that wasn't mine to make, in your own home, without asking you first. That was wrong, and I'm sorry. I should have woken you and asked what you wanted done. I didn't, and that's why your anger is justified." She stood there completely disarmed. She'd braced for the usual male reaction, pride, excuses, a lecture. Running headlong into Nate's humble understanding knocked her flat. "Hear me out for a minute, Sarah Jane," he went on, holding her eyes. "Then you decide what to do, because this is your ranch. Last night I had him dead in my sights. I could have killed that man, Ike, and not a soul would have batted an eye. Not the law, not God, not you. One less thief in the world. But hearing him talk about his hungry kids, something in me froze up. And it wasn't just kindness. It was pure selfishness, too, because I lost my own child, Sarah Jane. Buried him with my own hands. If I kill a father and leave 5 children with nobody, how do I face my maker when my time comes? How do I look Rose in the eye up there and tell her I left 5 children orphaned over a couple of cows?" Sarah Jane swallowed hard, feeling her anger cool into an uncomfortable, bitter truth. "Those people aren't criminals, Sarah Jane," he insisted gently. "They're desperate fathers. Yes, they're stealing, and that's wrong. I'm not excusing it. But I've spent 4 years walking these roads. I've seen every kind of man there is, and I know the difference between a lost cause and a man backed into a corner. Ike's the second kind. Poverty drives a man to do crazy things. Killing him doesn't fix anything. All it does is leave 5 orphans in misery, and the problem's still sitting right there because more hungry men will come after him. You want to fix this kind of thing, you've got to offer a way out. There's no other road. A man who can earn his bread honest doesn't risk it stealing in the dark. Nobody steals for the fun of it, Sarah Jane. It's the belly that does it, and that man's belly is empty." A heavy silence settled between them. In the kitchen, the coffee had started boiling hard, but she didn't move. Her mind raced 1,000 miles an hour, torn between the plain logic of a victim's anger and an old ache that Nate, without meaning to, had stirred up the ghost of her own hunger. Because she'd known scarcity too as a girl, long before she ever met Thomas, back when her family scraped by however they could through the worst winters. The memory rushed back, her mother crying in an empty kitchen, her father's beaten-down shape coming home with no wages to show for the day. And above everything else, she remembered what that good man nearly pushed to the edge by poverty once told her. "Girl, when hunger bites hard enough, honor sometimes bends. God spare us from those nights." After what felt like an eternity, Sarah Jane asked quietly, "What's his name? The one who's coming?" "Ike," Nate answered. "And you're sure he'll actually show up?" "I don't know," Nate admitted. "Might be he thinks it's a trap and we never see him again. But if he really comes, if he's got the nerve to stand here in plain daylight unarmed and face us after robbing us blind, look, Sarah Jane, that man's still got some honor left in him. And somebody like that deserves a chance, even a small one." She stayed quiet a good while, looking out over the pasture at the cattle that morning untouched because the intruder hadn't fired a single shot. At last she sighed, deep-like, setting down a heavy weight, and said, "I'm going to pour the coffee. If he comes, I'll listen. I'm not promising anything more than that. I listen first, then I decide. On my ranch, I decide, Nate. Make no mistake about that." "Wouldn't have it any other way," he answered. And for the first time since he'd arrived, something close to a smile crossed his face. "It's your ranch. I'm just here to advise. Last word's yours." And so Sarah Jane went inside to make the coffee with no idea that her choice to listen before hating would mark the turning point of her whole life. Ike showed up right around noon. She saw him coming a long way off down the same dirt road Nate had ridden in on, and her blood ran cold at first, thinking he'd come to do her harm. But she noticed right away he was on foot, walking slow, hat in his hand as a sign of respect and humility. No weapon anywhere in sight. He'd kept his word. He'd come unarmed to face them, and that poor man was every bit as scared as she was. It showed in his slumped shoulders, his lowered eyes,
and those short, uncertain steps of a man who doesn't know if he's about to get a bowl of soup or a bullet. Nate came out onto the porch and stood beside her. A generous gesture, since he didn't step in front, but stood at her side, respecting her place as owner of the land. Ike stopped a few yards from the gate, gripping his hat so tight his knuckles went white. "Morning," he said, voice barely there, and he looked Sarah Jane straight in the eye, a courage that clearly cost him everything he had. "Ma'am, I'm the one who's been stealing your cattle. I'm the only one here to face you and ask forgiveness. I came because this man here," he said, nodding toward Nate, "told me last night there might be honest work for me. But before anything else, ma'am, I want you to know what I did was flat wrong. I know it full well, and it sits on my soul like a stone." Sarah Jane looked him over in silence. He was a man of maybe 30-some years, but with a face aged hard by poverty. Thin clothes patched 100 times over, boots worn clean through the soles. He had the look of a man who hadn't had a hot meal in days, and hands calloused from real work. This wasn't the face of a criminal. It was the face of an exhausted father, the very same one she remembered on her own father during the hungry winters of her childhood. "How many children do you have?" she asked, tongue flat, guard still up. "5, ma'am," he answered. "Oldest is 10, youngest just shy of 2. And my wife's been sick in the chest since her last baby came. Can hardly get out of bed most days." We were getting by on what I earned as a hired hand over at the Miller place, but the drought closed them down and they let everybody go. I looked for work everywhere, ma'am. I swear it on my children. Walk through whole towns and there's nothing at all. And look, going hungry yourself, a man can stand that. But when it's your own child crying at night because his belly's empty, and you've got nothing to give him, his voice broke and he lowered his head. "Forgive me, ma'am. A man does crazy things watching his children suffer. I'm not making excuses, just explaining. I stole because I didn't see any other way out, but I know it's wrong, and that's why I'm here to pay for it, whatever that costs me." A heavy silence fell over the porch. Sarah Jane felt Nate's eyes on her, but he didn't say a word, didn't push. He let her decide. And Sarah Jane, who'd always been a hard woman, tough as flint, felt her inner walls start to crack. She believed every word because she knew that desperation herself. In fact, 40 years back, her own father had come within a hair of doing the very same thing. Only luck and the grace of God kept him from ending up exactly like Ike. "Look at me, Ike," she ordered, and the man raised his head. "I'm going to say something, and I want you to listen close. What you did was wrong. You took food out of my mouth. You kept me up nights for weeks, scared half to death in my own house, thinking any night you might come do worse than steal a cow. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. You did me real harm." Ike lowered his head again, swallowing his shame. Then Sarah Jane went on, her tone softening a touch. "I went hungry as a girl too, and I know what that feels like. I know what it is to watch a good father come apart at the seams because he can't feed his own. My father came right up to that same edge and nearly fell over it, so I'm not the one to throw the first stone at you, Ike." She lifted her chin, gathering back the authority of the woman running this ranch. "Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to give you work on this ranch. I need the hands. I've been holding this place together alone for 3 years, and I can't keep it up much longer by myself. There's cattle to tend, fences to mend, a well to keep up, 100 jobs. I'll pay you fair. Not much, because I don't have much to spare, but enough that you can feed your children without stealing from anybody or risking your neck in the dark. But I've got one condition. Just one. And it's not negotiable." "Whatever you say, ma'am," Ike answered, eyes bright with tears and hope. "Never again," Sarah Jane said, holding his gaze steady. "You will never steal from me, or from anybody else again. Day I find out you've stolen so much as a chicken egg, this is over. No second chances, no forgiveness. On this ranch we earn our living working, not stealing." So it'll be, ma'am. So it'll be, Ike stammered, voice completely broken.
That rough, weathered man stood right there in the middle of the porch and wept openly, gripping his hat the way only someone who's gone an eternity without a single act of kindness can weep. God bless you, man. And this man, too. I swear on my children's lives you won't regret this. You'll have the most loyal hand who ever set foot on this land. I swear it. All right, Sarah Jane cut in, uncomfortable with so much gratitude because that's how good-hearted people are uneasy accepting praise. Don't swear so much, just show me with your work that means more than words. Go get your family, and if the other two who were with you last night want honest work too, send them to talk to me. Never enough hands around here. And bring your wife too, the one who's been ailing. We'll find someone to look after her. There's plenty of room on this land and not enough good people to fill it. Go on now, see to your family. Ike wiped his tears with his forearm, not unable to get another word out. And before he left, he did something neither Sarah Jane nor Nate expected. He stepped forward, took her rough hand in both of his, and kissed it like he was honoring a saint. You're an angel, ma'am, he murmured. An angel the Lord put in front of me right when I couldn't see any way out. And he set off back down the dirt road, but this time with his head high, steady steps and his hat back on. A completely different man from the one who'd arrived an hour before. Sarah Jane stood watching him go, still feeling the warmth of that kiss on her hand, not quite able to grasp what had just happened. Her heart felt too full for her tired chest to hold. Beside her, Nate watched her with a look she'd never seen on him before, a mix of admiration and pure tenderness. I was wrong about you, he said gently. How so? She asked. Last night I figured this would be hard for you to forgive. You're a tough woman, and you are. But it's the kind of toughness that guards a tender heart underneath, like the shell on a walnut. Not many folks forgive like that, Sarah Jane. Few who've suffered as much as you still hold on to the kindness to forgive somebody who wronged them. Rose was exactly the same, and it's about the most beautiful thing a person can have. And Sarah Jane, who hadn't heard a compliment in 3 years, nor gotten a look that's sincere, felt her cheeks go warm. She dropped her eyes and blurted the first thing that came to mind to cover the feeling. We're going to need more food around here, with all these new mouths. I'll go check what's left in the pantry. She hurried inside, heart pounding for a reason that had nothing to do with fear, one she still wasn't ready to admit to herself. Within a week, Sparrow Creek was bursting with life again. Ike kept his word. The very next day, he came back with his whole family. His wife Abigail, pale thin, with a cough that tore at her chest, riding in on a borrowed wagon, and their 5 children. 5 little ones with enormous eyes and patched clothes, looking at the ranch with the wonder of children who'd never had a real roof over their heads. Behind them came the other 2 men who'd been riding with Ike that night. One was Gideon, quiet and strong as an oak. The other, an orphan boy of about 18 they called Toby, pulled into stealing by hunger and having nobody left in the world. Sarah Jane gave all 3 of them work. There was room to spare at Sparrow Creek, and hands had been scarce for years. It had been so long since she'd seen this many people gathered on her land, not since before Thomas died, that at first it overwhelmed her. She'd grown used to the silence, to the only sounds on the ranch being the turning windmill and the distant lowing of cattle. All of a sudden, the yard filled with a beautiful kind of chaos. Children running, laughter, the babies crying, the ring of men fixing fences. In the evenings, she could hear Abigail's voice, too, singing to her children whenever the coughing gave her a break. And Sarah Jane, who thought she could never stand that much noise, discovered something that happens to all of us, that the noise of life does the soul good. One afternoon, watching the little ones play, she caught herself smiling, really smiling. It had been so long, she'd nearly forgotten what it felt like. The old grain shed out back that Thomas had meant to use for storage, still empty all this time, got fixed up to house Ike's family. Working hard, the men cleaned it out, patched the roof, put in windows, and in just a few days had a modest but decent home. Abigail, badly weakened, settled into the back room. Well bundled up, she started getting Sarah Jane's care, who knew her way around healing plants from her own mother and grandmother. She brewed her mullein and eucalyptus teas for her chest, and hot broths, since the poor woman was skin and bone. Little by little, the cough eased, and color came back into Abigail's cheeks. One afternoon, hearing her sing while she sewed, Sarah Jane stood frozen, listening. How much this place had needed that music. It had been an eternity since a woman's voice sang at Sparrow Creek. And in the middle of all that lovely revival stood Nate, whose presence nobody questioned anymore. Nobody brought the matter up again. The man simply belonged there now like he always had. He took charge of the range work with an ease that left Sarah Jane amazed. He organized the hands divided up the chores and fixed things that had been broken for years. He broke 2 colts Thomas had left untrained and repaired the windmill that had barely drawn water in months. He brought back a pasture that had gone to ruin from neglect, all without a shred of boasting, in that same quiet, steady way of working that Sarah Jane knew so well. It was Thomas's style exactly. The style of real country folk, who love their work and don't need applause from anybody. Still, what really touched Sarah Jane's heart wasn't his skill with the work, but his warmth with people. She watched him with Ike's children, teaching them to ride with endless patience, laughing at their tumbles and helping them back up. She watched him with the orphan boy, Toby, treating him almost like a son, teaching him the trade, and giving him the kind of fatherly affection the boy had never known. She watched him with the animals, speaking to them, gentle, caring for them. And she who'd sworn never to look at a man again except with suspicion found herself watching him in secret from the window. How strange the human heart can be. Because Nate was stirring up something inside her she'd thought was long dead. One afternoon, while they were stacking firewood by the outdoor stove, Nate paused to wipe the sweat from his brow. Looking out at the horizon, he confessed, "You know something, Sarah Jane? It's been 4 years since I slept a full night through. Ever since I lost Rose, I'd lie there tossing, remembering, praying, just to fall asleep, and it never came. And these past few days, I don't know what it is about this place. Don't know if it's the tiredness, the air, or what, but I sleep. Sleep like I haven't in years, like something's finally loosened up in my chest." She stopped stacking wood, holding a log in her hands. "Same happens to me," she said quietly. "I've been sleeping since you got here. Before, I'd spend the whole night wide awake with the shotgun scared out of my mind. Now I lie down knowing someone's keeping watch. I know I'm not alone, and I fall right asleep." A thick silence fell between them, while the sun sank behind the hills, painting everything orange, just like that first evening he'd arrived. They looked at each other, and for one long, dangerous moment, neither one spoke. Sometimes silence says far more than words ever could, and there, floating between them, was a feeling they both shared, but neither dared to name. Something warm and forbidden that carried hope and guilt in equal measure. Sarah Jane, her heart racing, broke the moment, bending down for more firewood, and said, voice too forced, "Getting late. I'll go start supper." Nearly running, she took refuge in the house, leaving Nate alone by the fire, watching her go with a mix of sadness and a feeling he hadn't known in 4 years. Something that scared him, too. That night they both lay awake, thinking of each other, separated by a wall, speaking in silence to their departed, she to Thomas, he to Rose, asking forgiveness for what was starting to bloom in their hearts. And deep in their souls, though neither dared admit it out loud, a question began to stir. Wouldn't their loved ones, wherever they were, want to see them live again, rather than watch them waste away in endless grief? When Sunday came, Sarah Jane made a decision she'd been avoiding since she was widowed. She climbed the hill. There, in the shade of the big old cottonwood, her husband rested alongside his ancestors. In the early days of her mourning, she used to climb up there every week to grieve at his grave. Over time she stopped, not for lack of love, but because coming back down always left her wrecked, and a woman running a ranch alone can't afford the luxury of falling apart every Sunday. So the visits had stopped so completely that nearly a full year had passed without her setting foot in the family plot. But that particular Sunday, she felt an overwhelming need to climb up there, because her heart was in turmoil, and she needed urgently to talk to Thomas. She sat down in the dirt beside the wooden cross she'd planted with her own hands 3 years before. She cleared away the dried grass on the grave and set the stones back in place, quiet. From that hill, you could see the whole ranch spread out, the house, the windmill, the shed where Ike's family now lived, and the children playing below. Sparrow Creek had life in it again, and down below she could make out Nate gentling a colt with endless patience.
Oh, Thomas, she sighed, looking straight at the cross. If you could see the ranch now, you wouldn't believe it. It's full of people again, children running around where you and I always wanted to see them and never got the chance. The fences are all mended, and the windmill's pumping water again like it did back in your best years.
You wouldn't believe it, old man, but this ranch is more alive than it's been in years. Silence settled. The wind stirred the leaves of the cottonwood, and her voice, trembling, confessed what was truly burning inside her.
There's a man, Thomas. Her tears finally broke. There's a man, and I don't know what's happening to me.
You know, after you left, I locked that door and threw away the key. I never let anybody in. Plenty tried, and I ran every last one off because none of them held a candle to you, and I didn't want anybody else. I loved you. But you were gone. I'd resigned myself completely to spending the rest of my days in total solitude. Sure, it was the right thing, so I'd never betray our beautiful life together. She wiped her eyes, but the crying didn't stop.
But this man is different, Thomas. He never came after my land or anything of the sort. He simply came asking for a drink of water and stayed to protect me without asking for anything in return. He's good with people and with animals, noble, the same as you were.
And he lost the very same thing I did. His wife, his baby, before it was even born. And his land, too. He's broken inside, same as I am. And looking at him, Thomas, I feel something coming back to life that I thought I'd buried with you. It fills me with such guilt that just tears me apart. I feel like I'm betraying you, like I'm spitting on 19 years of real love. The wind picked up, and the cottonwood leaves whispered together like the tree itself was speaking. Sarah Jane closed her eyes.
Tell me, what do I do, old man? She whispered. Say something, because I can't do this alone.
There was no answer, of course. The dead don't speak. But she stayed there, sitting a while longer in silence. And funny how life works, because little by little, as the breeze dried her tears, something inside her settled. She remembered Thomas's kindness, his generosity, how when she'd cried over never being able to give him children, he'd comforted her, instead of holding it against her. He'd always wanted only the best for her. In the deepest part of herself, Sarah Jane felt an absolute certainty. Not sure if it was her own voice or his speaking to her from beyond. Thomas would never have wanted her to waste away in grief. A man who truly loves you doesn't wish you a lifetime of loneliness and mourning. He'd want her to live to laugh again, even if it was with somebody else. You were always the better one of us, Thomas, she murmured with a sad smile through her tears. I know what you'd tell me. Live, woman, don't die along with me. You're still here. She stood, brushed off her skirt, and touched the sun-warmed wooden cross. Thank you, old man, she said, for 19 years and for this. Rest easy. I'll be all right. She said her goodbyes before heading down the hill, a lightness in her chest she hadn't felt in years. Reaching the corral, Nate had just finished with the colt and was giving him water. Seeing her approach, her eyes red but full of a new kind of peace. He could tell right away where she'd been. Went to see my husband, Sarah Jane offered before he even asked. Up on the hill. Hadn't been up there in near a year. Nate nodded, genuine respect in his eyes. And how's he doing? he asked, completely serious. She, surprised, smiled softly.
Good, she answered. He gave me his blessing.
Blessing for what? Nate wanted to know. Instead of answering, Sarah Jane just looked at him a long moment, a silence heavy with everything left unsaid. Then she turned and walked toward the house. Nate stood frozen, water bucket still in hand, feeling his heart beat in a way it hadn't in 4 years. He could barely take in what that woman had just told him with only a look. That night, he too went searching in his mind for his late wife. Sitting under the stars, he spoke to Rose in the quiet of his soul. He told her about Sarah Jane, asked her forgiveness, and waited just as she had for some kind of sign. And wouldn't you know it, the sign came. Rose's gentleness came to his mind, how much she would have wanted his happiness. She'd never have wanted him wandering 4 years like a dead man walking, carrying his own grief the whole way. Live, Nate thought he heard in her soft voice. I've already found my rest, but you haven't. Live for both of us. And he who'd spent 4 years running from every kind of attachment finally felt the desire to stay for good at Sparrow Creek. But fate, which never makes things easy, was about to put that budding hope to the test. The peace lasted 3 weeks, and then they came. Sarah Jane didn't know it, but Nate did. When a dying ranch comes back to life, when the fences get mended and the cattle start to thrive, it catches the eye of just about everybody. The news spread through the county like wildfire. Word around town was that Sparrow Creek had come back from the dead, that the widow had new hands working for her, and that the place was thriving like never before. But rumors like that, out here, in wild and lonely country, don't always land in friendly ears. And the men who showed up next were nothing like Ike. Nate knew it the instant he saw them. Watching them come up the road, his blood ran cold. 5 riders, armed to the teeth, carrying themselves with the brazen swagger of men who live off what belongs to somebody else. Their faces weren't tired, they were cold, the look of men who kill without a second thought. Riding in front was a big man with a black beard, eyes like stone, 2 revolvers on his hip and a rifle across his saddle. The leader went by the name Crow, a ruthless man who, along with his gang, had spent years terrorizing the county with cattle theft, extortion, and burned-out ranches, leaving a trail of blood behind him wherever he rode. Nate understood everything the moment he saw them from the corral. He hollered for Toby to run and warn the others, and with steady steps put himself between the outlaws and Sarah Jane's house. He stepped forward to shield her with his own life. Crow pulled up his horse a few yards off and looked Nate over with contempt. "Afternoon," he said with a smile that promised nothing good. "Come to see the owner of this outfit?" the stranger declared, mocking. "Was told it was a poor, helpless widow, though I see she's not so helpless anymore." He narrowed his eyes at Nate. "And who might you be?" "The new husband. I'm the man who watches over this ranch," Nate replied, calm, holding his stare. "What can we do for you?" At the sound of hooves, Sarah Jane had come out onto the porch. She went pale seeing them, but didn't back down. She stood there, shotgun in hand, arms trembling despite herself. From around the buildings, Ike's men started to appear. Ike himself, Gideon, and young Toby, armed with whatever they had, shovels, axes, an old revolver. They weren't gunslingers, just working men, but they numbered 6, and they'd defend their livelihood. With a sneer growing crooked on his face, Crow took a quick look around to size up his opposition. "Well, well," he scoffed. "Looks like the little widow's put together herself an army." He leaned over the saddle horn, tone turning icy. "Let me explain how things work around here. Every ranch in this county pays me a monthly fee. In exchange, I don't burn down houses, don't steal cattle, and nobody gets hurt. Call it protection." He turned toward Sarah Jane. "The widow I let slide before, too poor to bother with, wasn't worth the ride. But I see this place is thriving now, so I've come to collect what's owed and settle the account going forward. I want 20 head of cattle right now, and 5 more every month after that. Anybody's got a problem with that? He added, resting a hand on his gun. We settle it right here. A dead silence fell over the yard. Sarah Jane's legs went weak. 20 head was nearly half of what she had left, and handing over 5 a month would spell complete ruin. But worse than losing the cattle was the cold-blooded violence radiating off these men. She knew a refusal would mean a bloodbath. She searched desperately for Nate's eyes, and found him standing firm, unshaken, staring down Crow without flinching. "This ranch doesn't pay anybody," Nate said, his voice quiet but hard as iron. "This lady has already paid plenty. She won't be handing over a single head." He let that settle. "Not one." Crow let out a dry, ugly laugh. "That's so! And who's gonna stop me?" "You and this handful of half-starved farmhands, me," Nate answered. "And I'll give you a reason to turn that horse around." He took a step forward, and even Crow tensed at the sheer stillness in the man. "I've traveled a lot of ground, and I've seen plenty like you. Men who think they own everything just because they're carrying 2 guns and scaring widows. But you know what happens to men like that sooner or later? They run into somebody who isn't afraid of a single thing anymore. Somebody who's already lost it all and doesn't have anything left to guard." He held Crow's stare. "How do you scare a man who's already dead inside?" "With death itself." He looked him dead in the eye. "That's the kind of man I am. And I swear to you on everything I loved that's resting 6 feet under right now, that if you lay one finger on this woman or her people, there won't be a corner of this country you can hide in. Think hard on it. Ride out today and don't come back. Best advice you're going to get." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. Crow's 5 men watched their weapons. So did the 6 standing with the ranch. One wrong move, and it would end in a massacre. Sarah Jane could barely draw breath. Crow fixed his eyes on Nate, and for a split second, just an instant, something like doubt flickered across that stony gaze. That outlaw had seen plenty of the world, and knew how to tell a bluffer from a man who means it. Nate standing there in the middle of the yard, calm, with the eyes of a man who no longer fears losing anything because there's nothing left to lose, wasn't bluffing one bit. But a boss like Crow couldn't afford to look weak in front of his own men. He straightened in the saddle, spat on the ground, and said, "You've got sand, old man. I'll give you that." He turned his horse to leave, then added, "Though sand doesn't stop bullets. I'll give you 3 days to gather 20 head of cattle. I'll be back Thursday, and they'd better be ready." He gave Sarah Jane a chilling smile. "Come up short even 1 cow and I'll come back with more men and take everything. Not just the 20 head. The widow, too. Chew on that." The 5 of them spurred their horses and rode off at a gallop, kicking up dust and leaving the ranch buried in a silence like death itself. As the dust settled, Sarah Jane came down off the porch, legs shaking, to find Nate. "They're coming back," she stammered, voice broken. "Thursday. And if we don't hand over the cattle, they'll kill every one of us. That kind doesn't know mercy, Nate. I've heard Crow burned a whole ranch down last year, family and all, still inside. What do we do? 6 men with shovels against armed killers. They'll wipe us out." Nate looked at her steadily, in silence. There wasn't a trace of fear on the old man's face. What Sarah Jane saw in his eyes was something new, the cold, calculating resolve of a man who's stood on a battle line before and knows exactly what real fighting looks like. "No, Sarah Jane," he murmured. "They're not going to wipe us out because we're not going to wait for them like sheep. 3 days is plenty of time if you know what to do with them. Men like that fight like bullies, counting on nobody having the nerve to stand up to them. They've never gone up against people who know the land and know how to organize, trust me." His eyes settled on hers. "I've held worse ground than this, and this time I've got a reason worth fighting for. A damn good one." Saying those words, his eyes locked with Sarah Jane's, leaving no doubt about who he was willing to risk his life for. Over the following 72 hours, Sparrow Creek transformed into a fortress. Nate barely rested, putting to use a soldiering background Sarah Jane hadn't even known about. He'd later admit that as a young man he'd fought in some border skirmishes up north, learning the art of the ambush. He divided up the work and organized the hands. They dug trenches at the key approaches to slow the horses down. They reinforced the house and boarded up the windows, leaving only narrow slits to shoot through. They gathered every weapon they had: Nate's Winchester, Sarah Jane's shotgun, Ike's old revolver, and a rusted rifle they found in the shed that the old man managed to get working again. Between Gideon and another hand, they scraped together a couple more shotguns. A poor arsenal, sure, but Nate knew that in fights like this, victory doesn't go to whoever's got more powder, it goes to whoever thinks straighter. He taught the ones who couldn't shoot straight how to aim, how to breathe, how not to waste a single round, and hold their fire. He walked the property foot by foot to place every man just right. He rigged traps too, ropes stretched chest-high between the trees along the road to knock riders clean off their horses. He also piled up dry wood soaked in coal oil to build a wall of fire. The cattle were hidden out in the farthest, most sheltered pasture to avoid an easy grab. Finally, Nate gave the order to move the women and children out. He got Abigail, Ike's still recovering wife, safely away, along with the 5 children and Toby. Toby, being the youngest, he wanted kept clear of the danger entirely, sending him off to stay with a friend a day's ride away. But Sarah Jane planted her feet. "This is my ranch," she snapped at Nate when he asked her to leave. "My husband, my father-in-law, and my grandfather-in-law are all resting on that hill. I'm not hiding while other people bleed for what's mine. I know how to shoot. My father taught me as a girl. I'm staying, Nate. And don't you dare argue, or have you forgotten whose house this is?" The old man studied her in silence for a long moment. Inside, Nate raged to argue back. He wanted to beg her to get to safety, because the mere thought of something happening to her squeezed his heart in a way that scared him. But he knew Sarah Jane. He knew she was stubborn as a mule and braver than most. And besides, he understood she was right. It was her land. "All right," he relented finally. "You stay. But you fight from inside the house, well covered behind the gun slits. And promise me one thing. Swear to me that if it turns bad and we're losing, you won't play the hero. You get on a horse and you ride fast and save yourself. Swear it to me." "I won't swear you anything," she replied. "All I'll promise you is that I'll fight with everything I've got." She held his gaze. "That's my only promise. You do the same, and come Friday morning the 2 of us will still be here talking about all this." With a knot in his throat, Nate accepted the deal. He raised his hand and, surprising even himself, gently brushed back a loose strand of hair that had escaped her bun, his rough fingers grazing her cheek. It was a small gesture, but it carried everything they'd both left unsaid. "Deal," he whispered, hoarsely. "Friday, both of us alive." And on Wednesday night, the last one before Crow's return, with the defenses set and the hands resting in shifts, Sarah Jane and Nate found themselves alone on the porch, gazing up at the sky, both aware that they might never see those stars again. "Nate," Sarah Jane said, breaking the silence after a long pause, "if luck turns against me tomorrow, I want you to know something." "Nothing's going to happen to you," he cut in. "Let me finish," she insisted. "I spent 3 years dead inside. I worked, I ate, I slept, but I didn't feel a thing. Then you showed up, asking for water, and you gave me my breath back. In just a few weeks, you've given me back the will to live that I thought was buried for good. Whatever happens tomorrow, I wanted you to know that. Because of you, I feel alive again." Hearing her, Nate went still, and his voice dropped to a murmur. "I've started feeling things again, too. Things I thought I'd forgotten." He looked at her through the shadows, heart pounding, and for the first time in 4 years, he let himself take that step. He took Sarah Jane's hand in his, that rough, brave hand, and held it tight. "Same things happened to me," he confessed. I was dead too, Sarah Jane. Spent 4 years wandering these roads like a ghost, and you brought me back with your courage, your kindness, and that way you have of forgiving even the people who wronged you. I don't know if I deserve this. I feel guilty, I feel scared. But I feel it for you, Sarah Jane, and I don't care anymore if it's too soon, if it's not proper, or if the ones we lost are watching. I feel it, and I wanted to tell you today in case tomorrow I can't. And so they stayed there, joined together in the middle of the night, two broken souls who'd found each other in the hardest moment of their lives. It didn't take a kiss to seal it. There was something far deeper in those clasped hands and those whispered confessions under the stars before the battle. It was a silent promise between two people who, after losing everything, had found a reason to keep going. The next day, they'd fight tooth and nail, not just for land and cattle, but for that small, fragile hope of being happy again. Thursday dawned, and with the first light on the horizon came the riders. But this time, there weren't 5. Crow had kept his word and brought along more than a dozen armed men. They came at a trot in formation, kicking up a thick cloud of dust, more than a dozen men armed to the teeth. Sarah Jane, watching from a gun slit in the house with the shotgun in her sweating hands, felt her chest close up. 2 against 6, that had been bad enough. Now it was outlaws against farmhands by a wide margin. It looked like the end. But Nate's cunning was about to even out that terribly uneven scale. He let the riders push in, confident and cocky, sure this would be easy pickings. He let them advance right into the trees where they'd strung the ropes the night before, and the instant the front riders passed through at a gallop, Nate gave the signal, and Gideon and another hand hauled hard on the ropes. 3 riders were yanked clean out of their saddles and slammed to the ground. Before the rest even understood what was happening, that's how fast disaster strikes, 2 were already unconscious, and another had a broken arm. That's when Nate lit the wall of coal oil-soaked wood stretched across the road. All at once, a wall of flame shot up, splitting the attackers into 2 confused halves, horses rearing in terror. "Now!" Nate shouted, and his men covered behind the barricades opened fire. They didn't shoot wild. They shot the way he'd taught them, aiming, breathing, choosing their targets. From her gun slit, Sarah Jane fired her shotgun and dropped a rider closing on the house. From behind the well housing, Ike took down another. Everything Nate had spent 3 patient days preparing, the surprise, the fire, the ropes, the terrain, it was all paying off. Those attackers who'd expected to find a flock of terrified lambs ran straight into a fierce, organized defense that sowed panic through their ranks. But there were a lot of them, and hardened, and Crow, roaring with rage from the rear, managed to pull them back together. The fight turned brutal. Bullets whistled everywhere, wood splintered, horses screamed, men shouted. Gideon went down, wounded in the leg, and one of the hands took a shot in the shoulder. Even as Crow's men fell too, their sheer numbers let them gain ground and close in dangerously on the house. That's when the thing Nate had feared most happened. Crow, realizing the house was the heart of the resistance, ordered 3 of his men to circle around through the corral where the defense was thinnest. Sarah Jane, focused on firing from the front, never saw them coming. But Nate did. From his position, he saw the 3 men jump the corral fence and run for the back door, straight for where she stood with her back turned, completely exposed. Without a second's hesitation, without thinking about the danger, Nate broke from his cover and ran, dodging crossfire, sprinting across the yard toward the back of the house, shouting Sarah Jane's name to warn her. A bullet grazed his arm, another whipped past his head, but he didn't stop. He reached the back just as the first attacker kicked the door in, aiming his gun at Sarah Jane's back. Nate fired, and the man dropped. The other 2 spun toward him, opening fire. Nate managed to bring down one more, but the third caught him square. Sarah Jane, whirling around at the commotion, watched in horror as Nate took the hit in the side, doubled over in pain, and dropped to his knees. But before he collapsed completely, pulling strength from somewhere he didn't have left, He raised his rifle and fired one last time. The third man fell dead at Sarah Jane's feet. "Nate!" She screamed a cry that tore through her whole soul. She ran to him as he crumpled, hand clamped to his side, his shirt soaking through, deep red. Outside, the battle raged on, but she could only hear her own heart pounding and his ragged breathing as she held him. "No, no, no," she kept saying, pressing hard against the wound to hold back the blood pouring through her fingers. "Don't you go. Don't you leave me too, please. Look at me. Stay with me." Nate opened his eyes. He was pale, but he looked at her and tried to smile. "Told you," he whispered, barely a voice left. "Promised we'd both make it to Friday alive. It's still Thursday. I'm holding on." "Hush, don't talk. Save your strength," Sarah Jane sobbed, tearing at her skirt to fashion a bandage to press against the wound. "You are not dying. I won't allow it, you hear me? I already lost one man in this life, and I am not losing another. You're going to make it, even if I have to drag you back from death's own hands myself." And outside, as if heaven itself had heard her desperation, the tide of battle started turning in their favor. Crow's men, seeing so many of their own fall, and running into resistance nobody had expected, started to break. And right then, like one of those miracles that only happens once in a lifetime, help appeared on the road. Toby, the boy Nate had sent off with the women for safety, hadn't just sat idle. He'd ridden hard to town and rounded up folks from other ranches, families who'd suffered the same extortion and terror under Crow for years. Now he came back leading more than 20 armed men, all determined to end this nightmare once and for all. Seeing that cloud of riders bearing down on him, and realizing half the county was about to come crashing down on his head, Crow knew he was finished. He tried to run, but there was no way out left. The local ranchers, worn out from years of abuse, surrounded him completely. That day at Sparrow Creek, that man's reign of terror came to an end. For good. For Sarah Jane, though kneeling in the dirt holding Nate as he bled, the victory meant absolutely nothing. The only thing that mattered to her in this whole world was keeping this man alive. And though Nate didn't die, he came awfully close. The bullet had lodged in his side, and after losing so much blood, the doctor who came riding hard from town, thanks to Ike fetching him, found him pale as death, burning with fever, barely conscious. Right there on the kitchen table, they dug the lead out while Sarah Jane held his hand, saying every prayer she could remember and inventing a few more on the spot. But then came the worst part, the fever. 3 days and 3 nights of agony, Nate drifting in and out, calling for Rose, talking with the dead, hovering somewhere between life and death. Through all of it, Sarah Jane never left his side, didn't eat, didn't sleep. She kept watch, laying cool cloths on his forehead, coaxing water down his throat, drop by drop whenever he could swallow. She changed his bandages, wiped away the sweat, and talked to him without stopping. She knew from having heard it once that folks caught in that in-between place are helped by hearing a voice calling them back. She told him everything about the children, the ranch, her plans, about Thomas and her own childhood. She begged him to stay, pleading with God not to take him. "Don't do this to me," she'd whisper through the nights, head resting on the edge of the bed, worn out with exhaustion. "Don't make me live having known the man who gave me my life back only to lose him. God can't be that cruel. Stay, Nate. We've got so much life left to live." And on the 3rd day, when hope was nearly gone, and the doctor warned that if the fever didn't break that night, there'd be no saving him, the miracle happened. The fever broke. Near dawn, he began sweating, heavy, the way a body cleanses itself. His breathing settled and color slowly returned to his cheeks. As the first light of morning filtered through the window, Nate opened his eyes, clear and calm at last. The first thing he saw was Sarah Jane, half asleep at the edge of the bed, still gripping his hand even in her sleep. "Sarah Jane," he murmured. She woke with a start and saw his eyes bright, his face at peace. She knew instantly the fever had broken, that he was alive, and she burst into tears. But this time, out of pure joy. Through the tears and laughter, she cradled his face, kissed his forehead and his cheeks, and finally dared to brush his lips with a kiss that was half promise, half miracle granted.
"You came back," she whispered. "Thank God you came back."
"Never planned on going anywhere," Nate murmured with a weak smile. "Promised you we'd both make it. And a man keeps his word." It took weeks for him to fully recover, weeks in which Sarah Jane nursed him with endless tenderness, and the whole ranch rallied around him. They loved him. They knew he'd risked his own life to defend every one of them. Ike took over the range work with the devotion of a grateful son. His children brought him drawings and wildflowers from the fields. Abigail, fully recovered now, thanks to Sarah Jane's care, made him the most restorative broths she knew how, and Sarah Jane never left his side, not for a single moment. During those weeks of recovery, between bandage changes and long talks, what had been quietly growing between them finally bloomed for real. And you know, friends, when you come close to losing everything, you learn to treasure what you have without holding anything back. Having stood at death's door, washed away every last trace of guilt in Nate, he no longer cared what the departed might think, or whether it was too soon or too late. Life had taught him just how fragile it all is, and he wasn't about to waste the love he'd found. One evening, nearly fully healed, he sat on the porch to watch the sunset, with Sarah Jane beside him. The sun sank behind the hills exactly like that first evening, the windmill humming softly, and the cattle grazing, in perfect peace, painting a picture of absolute stillness. That's when Nate looked at her and broke the silence. "Sarah Jane, there's something I need to tell you. Something that's been on my mind for days." She encouraged him to go on. "When I rode in here a few months back, I was a hollowed-out man. I kept moving so I wouldn't have to stop, because stopping meant remembering, and remembering hurt too much. I didn't want anything to protect, so I'd have nothing left to lose." She listened, taking in every word. "But now I've got this ranch to look after," he went on. "People I love like my own blood, and I have you. I built right back up everything I swore I'd avoid because it hurts too much. I'll admit it to you, Sarah Jane, it terrifies me to think that one day one of us won't be here anymore. The way I lost Rose or you lost Thomas. We both know full well that loving somebody means risking losing them, but you know what Nate learned in this life? That living without loving out of fear of getting hurt hurts a whole lot more. That's being dead while you're still breathing. And he didn't want to live like that anymore. He wanted to live alongside her, even if it hurt, even if it scared him half to death. "I want to live with you too," Sarah Jane confessed, eyes brimming with tears. That evening, under that same quince-colored sun that had first brought them together, those two broken survivors embraced, free of guilt and free of fear. They understood, deep down, that the ones they'd lost weren't watching them with resentment, but with the gentle smile of people who wish nothing but happiness for the ones they loved. They married when spring came, in a small, simple ceremony at the little church in town, no frills, but surrounded by the people who truly mattered. They asked Ike to stand as best man. Abigail, for her part, took charge of fixing Sarah Jane's hair, weaving in wildflowers and crying even harder than the bride herself. Ike's 5 children scattered fresh flower petals along the aisle. Gideon, fully healed from his leg wound now, and young Toby, that hero who'd brought help on the darkest day of all, watched on in their Sunday best, deeply moved. Not a single rancher from the county missed it either, all those who'd fought shoulder to shoulder against Crow. That battle had turned them into something like family folks, who now looked out for one another. The whole county became a far safer, far more united place because of it. In a simple dress that had belonged to her mother, Sarah Jane walked slowly toward the altar. Seeing Nate waiting for her, freshly shaved, in a clean shirt, those brown eyes that had once been so dim Now shining with a quiet joy, she felt her heart fill in a way she never thought possible at 41, after everything life had put her through. In that moment, she thought of Thomas, spoke to him in her heart, intimate. "Thank you, old man, for giving me your blessing to love again. I know you're happy for me, wherever you are." And she thought she felt, maybe just her imagination, a soft breeze brush her face, like a blessing sent down from above. At the altar, Nate took her hands and whispered, "Rose would have loved you, Sarah Jane. You're every bit as good as she was. I know your Thomas and my Rose are both smiling down on us right now, because real love never seeks its own good. It wants the happiness of the other, even at the cost of its own." That's how they loved us, they thought. And that's why we're standing here today, free of guilt and blessed. With tears of pure joy, Sarah Jane said her vows, and Nate answered with the same steady certainty. They kissed before God and everyone they held dear. The applause and the tears of joy gave way to a beautiful celebration at Sparrow Creek that lasted clear through until dawn. That ranch, which months before had only known loneliness and fear, now rang with fiddles, dancing laughter, and food enough for everyone. There was life in the air, love, and the warmth of a home they'd built together out of nothing. Almost without noticing, all of them together became a real family. Not one of blood, but one chosen, made of broken people who, joining together, found healing again. Sarah Jane, who'd never been able to have children, found herself suddenly surrounded by 5 little ones who called her Aunt Sarah and ran to hug her. Nate, who'd buried his only child before it ever drew breath, now taught those children to ride and grow into good people, and taught young Toby, too, who looked up to him like a father. Ike, who'd nearly lost his soul stealing in the dark, was now the respected foreman of a thriving ranch, an honest man, his own children looked at with pride. And Abigail sang every single day, filling Sparrow Creek with such joy that even the cattle seemed to bask in it. As if grateful for so much love, the land itself answered with generosity. That year the rains came steady, the pastures grew tall and green, and the herd multiplied. The 60 malnourished head Sarah Jane had left when Nate arrived became 120, then 200. They bought more land and built new homes for the families. Sparrow Creek rose up as one of the finest ranches in the whole county. But what truly filled Sarah Jane with pride wasn't some selfish prosperity the kind wealthy landowners chase. It was a ranch where nobody ever went hungry, where there was always work and a plate of food for anybody in need, and where the gate always stood open for the weary traveler. Neither she nor Nate ever forgot where they'd come from. The memory of loneliness, hunger, and hopelessness never faded. So they made a promise to each other that as long as they had anything to spare, no soul in need would ever leave their gate empty-handed. In the years that followed, plenty of exhausted, dust-covered travelers stopped at the fence line of Sparrow Creek, asking for a drink of water. And without fail, Sarah Jane or Nate came out to greet them with a full pail, inviting them in, offering food and shelter for the night. They knew better than anybody that a gesture as simple as a cup of water can be the start of a story that changes your whole life. They learned that behind even the humblest traveler might be hiding the happiness you thought you'd lost, and that kindness given freely is the seed true miracles grow from. And every time Sarah Jane handed a stranger a pail of water at the gate, Nate would watch from a distance. He'd remember that very first evening, that first pail, the sun sinking behind the hills, and that brave, lonely woman who'd opened the doors of her soul to a broken man. He thanked heaven every day for having been thirsty that afternoon, for having stopped to ask for that drink of water that gave him back the will to keep going. The years passed, many, many years, filled with the kind of rich fortune that fate saves for those who've suffered so much, as if trying to settle every debt the past ever owed them. The years brought wrinkles and gray hair to Sarah Jane and Nate, who grew old together with a sweet slowness at Sparrow Creek. They aged, savoring the peace of watching Ike's children grow up, like their own grandchildren watching the land prosper, watching dozens of weary travelers find at that beautiful ranch the helping hand they so badly needed. Toby, the orphan boy Nate had raised almost like his own son, grew into an honest, upright man, and in time married the eldest daughter of a neighboring rancher. Nate walked him down the aisle with all the pride of a father, which is exactly what he'd become to that boy. And Ike the man, who once cut a fence line in pure desperation to steal out of hunger, became, after Nate, the most respected man in the whole county. Never again in his life did he take a single thing that wasn't his. Ike's 5 children grew up healthy and educated. The eldest went off to study in the city and came back a school teacher, teaching every child in the county to read and write, even the ones who, if not for him, might have ended up just like their father, trapped in poverty and forced to steal. That's how, in the span of a single generation, the chain of hunger was broken. That's how one simple act of kindness, a widow who chose forgiveness over hatred, changed the fate of dozens of souls. Sarah Jane never had children of her own blood. That remained the one thorn she carried in her heart, an old grief she'd held since the days of her beloved Thomas. But one evening well into old age, sitting on the porch watching the sunset beside Nate, everything finally made sense. Surrounded by all those young people, now grown men and women, and their own little ones, climbing into her lap, calling her Grandma Sarah, Sarah Jane understood that God had given her, in his own way, more children than she ever could have borne herself. He'd given her an enormous family, chosen and earned through nothing but love. "What are you thinking about, Mrs. Coulter?" Nate asked her that evening, using her married name in that same gentle, teasing way they'd shared for years, holding her weathered hand in his, just as worn as hers. "Thinking about how happy I've been, Nate?" she answered, gaze fixed on the sun setting behind the ridge. "That same old sun, the one that brought us together that day so long ago." I realize now that life took so much from me, but it gave back even more. I think about how if I hadn't handed you that pail of water that evening, if fear had won out, and I'd locked myself in the house the way every instinct told me to, I would have missed all of this. This whole life. These years at your side. This great big family. Sarah Jane nodded to herself, reflecting on how the happiness of an entire lifetime can hinge on one single generous gesture, on opening the door to a stranger instead of shutting it, on reaching out a hand instead of hiding it away. Nate pressed a tender kiss to her weathered fingers. "It was the best pail of water of my whole life," he told her. "And I swear to you, Sarah Jane, that when my time comes to meet Rose again, and your Thomas too, wherever they are, the first thing I'm going to do is thank them. Thank them for loving us enough to let us go. Thank them for blessing us from above. And thank them for putting our paths together that evening, thirsty, with nothing but a pail of water between us, while the sun went down behind the hills." Sarah Jane rested her head on her husband's shoulder. The children played out in the yard. The windmill turned slow. The cattle grazed in the green pastures, and the sun sank orange and beautiful behind the ridge above Sparrow Creek, its golden light pouring over a ranch that had once known only loneliness and fear. That love born from a simple pail of water offered to a stranger had transformed it all into a home full of life, family, and peace. Because in the end, that's the deepest truth in this story and in so many others. Life breaks us. Sooner or later, we all face loss. We all face loneliness, fear, the dark night of the soul. And yet, somewhere down the road, a second chance always waits for us. Sometimes it arrives on horseback, tired and covered in dust, asking for nothing more than a little water. It's up to us whether we close the door out of fear or hold out the pail and let it in. Because in that small act, in that humble kindness, the happiness of an entire lifetime might just be waiting. Sarah Jane Whitmore Coulter and Nate understood that. And that's why, even though they lost so much in the end, they gained everything. And so that love, born from a simple pail of water, never truly found its ending. Do you think Sarah Jane did right opening her door to a stranger that evening? Or was it a reckless chance that just happened to turn out well? Tell me something. Has a small act of kindness, given or received, ever changed your life? Let me know in the comments. I read every one of them with my whole heart. And if this story touched you, leave a like and share it, because beautiful stories are meant to be told and meant to travel far.